After an absence of over half a century, it is time for human beings to return to the moon. American human beings, of course, because they're the ones that count. They're the only ones who have ever been to the moon in the first place, and we are the ones that are going to be returning triumphantly to the lunar surface once again. Here in just a few minutes, the SLS will be taking to the skies and excuse me, I hate to interrupt your little monologue, but we have a bit of a problem. Sergey, I told you you could watch quietly. Quietly, not say a damn thing. This is an American moment, all right? An American moment, and you damn Russians have nothing to do with it. Least of all, you, okay? Right, but I thought you might want to know, Joe, that you have no astronauts for this mission. Oh, that's funny. You had me going there for a minute, but that's my trick ear there. I thought I heard you say we have no astronauts. That's right. The crew number 1, they are down with COVID variant number 73. And what about the backup? The backup. The backup. They are currently on the ISS. What the hell are they doing up there? Well, because, to be honest, Joe, you don't have enough astronauts. What the are you talking about? What do you mean we have no astronauts? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. How the hell do we go and spend billions of dollars on new rockets for Artemis, and yet we don't get enough astronauts for the program in the first place? Nobody could have done something that stupid. It's impossible. Well, I'm afraid it is true. You started out this whole program with 1/3 the astronauts that you had 20 years ago. And, well, it just kind of ran out. Okay. So, hey, buddy, Sergey, you can loan us a few astronauts, right? I must remind you that President Putin wants me dead. Well, slowly tortured and then dead. Can't help you there, buddy. Abort the mission! Well, I'm afraid I've got one thing left to say. What's that? Ignition! No! All right, well, I hope you appreciate my sense of humor as always, and yes, I must confess that those figures were a bit inaccurate in that introduction. NASA actually has less than 1/3 the astronauts that they did 20 years ago. I know that sounds completely impossible and utterly ludicrous, but it's true. In the year 2000, we had 150 astronauts, and as of right now, we have 44. As absurd as that may sound, with all of the new ambitious programs that are getting started with manned space flight above and beyond what is needed for the ISS, by far, we have entirely too few astronauts for the job. And it's not just the numbers that matter, it's also the training, the education, the cross-section of necessary skills, and also, of course, the backups that are going to be required in case we have any problems with the crew selections as we proceed with these missions. We don't have nearly enough astronauts to accomplish what is necessary if we want to keep the ISS and the Artemis programs going through to the end of this decade. And this is something that has been obvious since 2016 when the program was first started. So what does all of this mean? Is NASA really this idiotic? Or did they ever intend to proceed with these plans in the first place? To answer this question, let's turn to a report that was released on January 11th by NASA's Office of the Inspector General, one of my favorite sources to turn to simply because these guys seem to be very good at discovering various levels of incompetence throughout the agency. Quote, "The processes NASA uses to train and assign astronauts to specific missions are primarily calibrated towards meeting the current needs of the ISS. However, the astronaut corps is projected to fall below its targeted size or minimum manifest requirements in fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023 due to attrition and additional spaceflight manifest needs. More concerning, the astronaut office calculated that the corps size would exactly equal the number of flight manifest seats NASA will need in fiscal year 2022. As a result, the agency may not have a sufficient number of additional astronauts available for unanticipated attrition and crew reassignments or ground roles such as engaging in program development, staffing astronaut office leadership and liaison positions, or serving as spokespeople for the agency. In light of the expanding spaceflight opportunities anticipated for the Artemis missions, the Corps might be at risk of being misaligned in the future, resulting in disruptive crew reorganizations or mission delays. So currently, NASA barely has enough astronauts to accommodate their needs for the ISS, to say nothing of future plans. And as far as Artemis is concerned, things get even worse. Quote, "As with sizing, the current astronaut training framework is primarily aligned to ISS mission requirements. The astronaut office is in the process of developing a framework for Artemis training, but this framework has not been formally chartered, nor have any Artemis crews been announced. As such, specific mission-focused training for the Artemis II mission, the first crewed Artemis flight, has not yet begun. While the astronaut office estimates training for the Artemis III and successor missions will require approximately 2 years, even with the projected delays to Artemis II and III launches, the agency could be overestimating the time available to develop and implement the necessary training framework and regimen across key Artemis systems, including the Orion, next-generation spacesuits, human landing systems, and Gateway." Now, the most obvious question is, how the hell could NASA have allowed this to happen? The first astronaut candidate class in 2013, at least amongst the two most recent, I can understand why they didn't select a whole lot of candidates, because the Artemis plan was not that far along. As a matter of fact, it hadn't even been created at that point, and only 8 candidates were selected out of 6,000 applicants. However, there was a second class in 2017. There were 18,000 applicants, triple the applicants that there were for the 2013 class, and yet only 12 candidates were selected. And this is when we knew damn well that we were going back to the moon. Why didn't Jim Bridenstine make allowances for the increased amount of personnel that would be required for such a mission, especially since we were going back to the moon by 2024, or so it was believed? And by the way, I know that this film suggests that there are actually 13 astronauts available, but the current number is indeed 12. In any event, there are more problems beyond this. NASA's current safety margin for attrition, illnesses, that sort of thing is only 15%. During the shuttle era, the safety margin was as high as 50%. A 15% attrition margin is not considered to be sufficient in order to cover all of the different seats necessary for all the missions coming up. Not even close. And then, of course, there's issues with cross-training. You have astronauts who are obviously going to be trained for the ISS, for EVAs in microgravity, extensive use of the Canadarm, that sort of thing, whereas the Artemis missions, especially Artemis 2, which won't involve the use of the Lunar Gateway at all, will not have any EVAs in microgravity, will not involve the use of the Canadarm, but will obviously require other sorts of training that astronauts assigned to the ISS will not have. And yet, this sort of complication has not been taken care of by NASA. Not even close. They haven't even started to address it. And we were supposed to go back to the moon by 2024? It leads me to believe that Jim Bridenstine never seriously thought that we were going back to the moon by 2024. As a matter of fact, 2025 seems practically impossible at this point. One of my supporters put it this way: consider if NASA acted now to expand the Corps with normal funding methods. The earliest they could start recruitment is October 1st of 2022 unless Congress does a mid-year appropriation. Assuming 1 year of recruitment, and that may be a bit overly optimistic, 2 years of standard training and 1 to 2 years of specific mission training, that means 4 to 5 years to fill the gaps by 2026 or 2027. Given the fact that Artemis is looking to land human beings on the surface of the moon by 2025, there's no way that that could be accomplished, at least not with the current training methods. It takes entirely too long to recruit and train astronauts who are the right stuff to go to the moon, and it simply isn't possible to do that sort of thing on the fly. Not even close, and I'm not certain what NASA was thinking aside from the obvious conclusion that Artemis wasn't going to survive in the first place. Because remember, 2016 is when Space Policy Directive 1, the whole Artemis program, got started, and yet insufficient astronauts were brought on to accommodate the needs of this particular program while keeping ISS going at the same time. Now, that was 5 years ago that this program got started. Certainly, plans could have been made for the astronauts necessary to accomplish these goals, but instead it seems far more likely that Jim Bridenstine or somebody else at NASA thought that this program wasn't going to survive, or that we simply weren't going to be landing on the moon until 2028 as we were planning to do all along. And believe it or not, the news gets even worse than that. Yeah, I'm not exaggerating here, guys. Here's the problem. As I said before, you need astronauts with a highly varied skill set in order to be able to accommodate both ISS and Artemis missions. The astronauts who go to the ISS are going to be trained very differently from the astronauts who land on the moon. So therefore, you want to make sure that you have a varied skill set amongst your available astronauts to make sure that you can cover all of the seats necessary for these missions, that you have the necessary training for all the missions coming up. However, according to the report, quote, "We found that astronaut skill set data is not consistently collected, comprehensively organized, regularly monitored or updated, or reviewed outside the candidate selection, planning, and assignment processes. The chief and deputy chief of the astronaut office said that they can use these various tracking systems if needed, but given the small number of astronauts, they primarily rely on their own informal knowledge of Corps membership to inform skill set decisions, including consideration of the skill sets needed in a candidate recruiting class. While informal knowledge has been used to manage ISS missions, a mission the agency has been conducting for over 20 years, we question whether this informal approach will be effective as the size of the astronaut corps increases, still involving Artemis requirements are incorporated, and attempts to track skill sets over time for multiple missions become more complex. We're talking about NASA here, we're talking about rocket science, and we're also talking about the fact that they have an informal method of determining whether or not they have the proper skill sets for upcoming missions. Are you kidding me? And yes, it gets even worse than that. And this is because the astronaut office, and this again is according to the report, estimates that the Artemis 3 and successor missions are only going to require about 2 years. However, the audit determined that over the course of 20 plus years, the agency streamlined ISS training from 5 years down to 2 years currently. What the hell makes NASA think that a new type of training, an entirely new training regimen that hasn't even been planned yet, is going to be able to train astronauts to operate on the moon in only 2 years when ISS training took 5 years in the old days at the beginning of the program? They are not allowing at all for challenges that are doubtless going to arise from training with the Gateway, training on the lunar starship for that matter, that doesn't even have a life support system designed at the moment. What makes them think that they're going to be able to train Artemis astronauts in the space of only 2 years when the ISS required 5 at the beginning of the program? And the report definitely points this out. And if all of that wasn't enough for you, the report goes on to say, quote, additionally, key Artemis systems such as Orion, Next Generation Spacesuits, HLS, and Gateway are still in development, and results from ongoing health-related risk reduction efforts from the ISS are not due until 2027. While NASA is in the process of establishing boards and panels to oversee the integration of astronaut training regimens and technical requirements related to the Artemis systems, as of November 2021, those boards and panels have not been finalized. And yet, in spite of the serious nature of this particular problem, or all of these problems, the Office of Inspector General has surprisingly few things to say, very few recommendations, because frankly, it's too late. If NASA wanted to handle this, they should have brought on a lot more astronauts than they did in the last class. So really, the only solutions that the Office of Inspector General recommends is to centralize the collection and monitoring of detailed astronaut data to evaluate whether or not 15% safety margin rather is sufficient for their current needs. It isn't, but that's all that they're going to be able to do. And also at least 18 months prior to the planned Artemis 2 launch, which is, I don't know, now, coordinate with Artemis program offices to complete the development and chartering of the framework of Artemis boards and panels to ensure alignment with future mission training needs for new vehicles and missions. But the problem is, the fundamental problem behind this whole situation that has only come up in the last few days is the fact that we don't have enough astronauts to accommodate both the ISS and Artemis, and nothing and no one can do anything about that, at least not in the time that we have left. How ironic, how awful it is to consider that with all of the technical challenges that Artemis faces, when we're talking about SLS, when we're talking about HLS, Lunar Starship, Lunar Gateway, etc., and plus new spacesuits, a lot of technical challenges that stand between us and our return to the moon. How strange it would be if a simple shortage of astronauts and a lack of necessary training would be the deciding factor as to whether or not we are able to return to the moon in anything resembling a timely fashion. If the 2024 date was never possible simply because we didn't have the astronauts to accomplish it, and even 2025 or 2026 may not be doable for the same reason. and simply because NASA can't count. And what gets me even angrier is the fact that the astronauts we do have are going to be called upon to carry out tasks that may be unreasonable given the amount of training that they're going to be provided, that they're going to be going to the moon with substantially less training and less preparation than the Apollo astronauts had, that we're going to be calling upon these incredibly talented individuals to accomplish the impossible, and that could result in fatal consequences and the end of the Artemis program before it really even gets started. That would be a truly awful scenario that I hope never comes to pass, and it is my sincere hope that these young talented individuals are able to rise to the challenge regardless of how unreasonable that challenge may be. If you like what I have to say, if you enjoy this type of commentary, well, you know how to support me. It's all in the description, and I'd like to offer my deepest thanks to my supporters who made my trip to the CES convention a huge, resounding success and a new step for this channel that I think all of you will find to be very entertaining and informative. So until NASA comes to realize that you can't carry out a much more ambitious space program without an ambitious number of astronauts, until they get this basic concept into their heads and gets the necessary funding and training so that our astronauts can carry out the ambitious missions that they have in the future. Until all of this comes to pass, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.